Hello and welcome to the Third Sector podcast. I'm Emily Burt.
I'm Andy Ricketts.
And I'm Lucinda Rouse. Each week we bring you half an hour of discussion and debate about the important goings-on in the charity world. This week we'll find out how one Scottish charity has successfully diversified its revenue streams in response to uncertain grant funding. We'll hear how they position themselves for enterprise and identified opportunities, as well as some of the risks and challenges encountered along the way.
But first, it's the morning after the night before. As we record this, it's 9 o'clock on Friday, the 5th of July, and we are about to see a new government and, of course, a new Prime Minister, as Labour have secured a landslide victory in yesterday's general election. And what a result it is. At the time of recording, there are just a few seats left to declare. Labour have so far gained 210, while the Conservatives have lost an extraordinary 249. And we've seen some big name casualties along the way. Jacob Rees-Mogg has lost his seat, and so has the former PM Liz Truss, which I actually woke up in time to catch on the BBC this morning. How late was everyone up watching this extraordinary event happen?
Well, I was up till about 4 a.m. and then was awake what seemed like far too early this morning, so I am feeling a little bit ropey this morning, probably like a lot of other people. What about you, Lucinda?
I don't feel too ropey, mainly because I was tucked up in bed and on my way to slumber by 11 o'clock. I did wake up a few times over the course of the night.
Nothing gets in the way of your sleep. You have to respect it.
Well, this is true. I briefly checked the results during the night, but no, that wasn't enough for me to lose sleep over, I'm afraid.
This is also a Friday. Because it's a Friday, I don't usually work Fridays. So we do also have another kind of surprise cameo guest in the room, which is my 1.5-year-old son. So just to say, if this recording does pick up any extra chat like that in the background, then that is what you are hearing.
And so with this changing government, this new Prime Minister, and of course this enormous majority in mind, we thought it would be useful to just spend a few minutes this morning reflecting on what the immediate changes and also slightly longer term changes could be for the voluntary sector. Andy, I know that you've been following this obviously for certainly the past 6 weeks and beyond. Let's start with the Charities Minister. Who's it going to be?
Well, that's actually a very good question, because I think everybody is expecting that Lillian Greenwood, who has been serving as the Shadow Minister for Civil Society since September last year, will just be anointed as the new Charities Minister, because basically that's what happened in 2010 when the Tories came in and formed the coalition government. Nick Hurd, who was then the Shadow Minister for Civil Society, was just kind of parachuted into that role straight away. But actually, one thing that is true of this current shadow Labour government is that it doesn't exactly reflect what the government currently looks like, because there are more ministers doing the jobs that Stuart Andrew, the former Charities Minister, who held a bunch of other ministerial positions, was doing. So I would expect that Lillian Greenwood would get the job, but that's not guaranteed, because Stuart Andrew, he was also the Minister for Tourism, Heritage, Lotteries, Gambling, Young People, a whole bunch of other things that currently are portfolios that are held by other shadow ministers in the Labour shadow setup.
So it may or may not be Lillian Greenwood, but she was the Labour voice at the voluntary sector hustings, which were hosted at the NCVO on the 19th of June. And she said that the sector would have a place in every government department, including the Treasury. Do you think this could mean that there could be a civil society minister in the new cabinet?
I would say that's probably unlikely, simply because what we've seen over the last sort of 15 years is that actually the Minister for Civil Society's position has slightly regressed in terms of its importance, certainly under the Conservative government. It used to be a Minister of State position, but it was reduced to Parliamentary Undersecretary about 10 years ago, I think. And I would be surprised if they would put a Minister for Civil Society in the cabinet. But saying that, Labour has been making some very positive noises about wanting to hear the voice of the voluntary sector in every part of its work. They say that all of their big kind of 5 missions that they want to do, they want to involve the voluntary sector. Keir Starmer has said that the voluntary sector is essential to Labour achieving its main ambitions over the course of this next Parliament, and he hopes the next decade. So that would suggest that you would need to have some kind of positive voice advocating for charities, unless you can get the voice of the voluntary sector kind of almost embedded, kind of like a stick of rock in everything that the new government does, which would require quite a sea change in the way that things currently operate.
Yeah, and I think cautious optimism are the words that would probably sum up how the voluntary sector in general has responded to this sentiment articulated by the Labour government ahead of the election of wanting to include charities in everything that they do and in achieving their ambitions. But we don't really know very much about the how yet, do we? And the Labour Party has faced some criticism from sector voices about this sort of lack of detail around exactly how they are going to get involved.
Yeah, that's right. And certainly over the last sort of 6 months since Keir Starmer set out his stall at a voluntary sector event back in January, and he said he wanted to get the voluntary sector involved, the big thing that people were saying then was, well, we need to see the detail. How is this going to work in practice? And we obviously haven't really had any of that since. And to be honest, it could be a little while before we do. I mean, we know some of the big things that Labour are going to be doing that are going to be affecting the voluntary sector. Obviously, the things like ending tax breaks for independent charitable schools is going to be one big thing that's going to be affecting organisations in that particular sector. We know that they've said they want to increase the aid budget back to 0.7% of gross national income from the current 0.5%, but they haven't said when they're going to do that. So, there are lots of little things like that they've sort of said they're going to do, but we don't actually know how it's going to shake down in practice.
I think you're absolutely right, Andy. And as you say, it's essentially now like the devil's going to be in the detail. We've had these very warm words. Back in January, Keir Starmer said that, he asked the sector to imagine a government that wanted to work in partnership with charities. And so now it really is all going to hang on whether they're going to make good on those warm words and those promises that they made when they were in opposition. And how that will play out for the sector, we'll just have to watch this space.
Now, there have already been a number of sector reactions, messages on social media from voices within the voluntary sector. And next week, we will be joined by Sarah Elliott, the Chief Executive of the NCVO, to reflect further on what the short and long term might hold for the sector in light of this outcome. Moving on to this week's main discussion. Have you ever considered enterprise as a means of plugging a looming funding void? It certainly requires a different way of thinking than a seasoned charity professional might be accustomed to. But one charity realised that relying on the public purse wasn't a sustainable way of supporting its service users and decided the only thing for it was to start generating more income through other means. New Start Highland exists to help people in northern Scotland live comfortably, free from hardship, and create opportunities for them to make the most of their potential and transform their lives. And we're delighted to be joined today from Inverness by the charity's Chief Executive, James Dunbar. Hi, James.
Hi, James.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Could you start, please, by telling us about New Start Highland's journey from a charity to a charity social enterprise blend? Why did you decide to go down this route and how did it happen?
Certainly. Initially, we were fully grant dependent. But in 2003, when our first round of grant funding was ending, I realised that for us to be able to continue to deliver services needed by our community, we had to take control of income generation and not rely solely on funding. Now, the financial crash in 2008 increased our need to develop reliable income streams because the pressure on our public sector was great and less money was being spent on people in poverty and roots out. So The activities we have for income generation, we've got a chain of 6 shops, including Uniqueness. Uniqueness makes absolutely gorgeous items. Every item is unique. They are stunning high-end pieces that we sell, and you can probably tell I love them. On top of that, we lease out commercial units. Our highest profile tenant we've had was a small company called FedEx, that multinational. We had the north of Scotland's FedEx distribution centre based at New Start Highland. We also have an order fulfilment service for the NHS and for some private customers. And we pack a variety of items for each of these contracts. On top of that, we have a house clearance service. The purpose of that is to help people at a difficult time, and it's just to relieve that pressure and take the items people don't want and put them to good use. And on top of that, we have a removal service, and we can do moves commercially for companies. We can do moves for individuals, and we cover the whole of the UK mainland, the islands as well. Our removal service includes some contracts with the public sector, but the majority of it is delivered business to customer. So that's a whistle-stop tour through some of our enterprise activities.
And that is extraordinarily diverse, everything that you're doing there. There's a really, really broad range of activities in there away from the more traditional charity services. I think this is such an interesting case study, and ones that I'm sure lots of organisations will be very curious about, because of course, you know, we have been through a really long-term funding crisis. You talked about having, you know, launched these new models in 2012, but you know, we've had nearly 15 years of austerity. Now we know that, you know, funds are getting smaller, local authority funding is getting smaller, and the sustainability of grant funding is an ongoing problem for many organisations. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about when you decided this was the way you needed to go to ensure the sustainability of your organisation. How did you start positioning yourself to be taking on those kind of those contracts, providing those top quality services? How did you get to that place where you felt you could confidently do it?
We started in 2003, and I remember being on holiday with my family in June 2003, and we were just facing a few months of our first grant that we had, and we had put together a couple of applications, and we'd framed that around developing enterprise activities. And in the beginning, we started with things that were quite close to what our skills were. I think it's really important when you start something that you try to do something that you have some of the skills to do. I sometimes say to people, nothing that we do is rocket science. So staying close to our skills. So if you think of removals, for example, we collect and deliver furniture. That's part of our main business. So doing that professionally and commercially is something that we understood how to do and how to do well. So we simply diversified from collecting furniture that we would take in, reuse, give out to people who couldn't afford any, or sell some through our shops. We diversified to doing that as a professional service. Now, there's slightly different ways of doing that. We had to ensure that every piece was treated like it was $1 million, because our possessions as individuals are really important to us. And we don't expect the removal company to damage anything. So that's one of the bits for us. So it was training the team to make sure they were fully skilled. And that was how we started. So it wasn't moving too far from what we already knew.
And what about instilling that entrepreneurial mindset into the organisation? Was it just you who had to have that, or did you have to bring in people onto the team?
Yeah, I guess most of the entrepreneurial thought comes from me. And what's important is to have the difference in taking people in to deliver a service as opposed to think of a new service. The important thing If you think of a charity, people operate knowing that if they've got a block grant, that money's coming month after month. There's no pressure on that money if you're delivering your outcomes. Whereas delivering a commercial service, you have to have a focus on quality, but you have to have as much of a focus in delivery on your numbers. So there was an adjustment for people, not so much about being entrepreneurial, but focusing on quality and focusing on finance. So that was one of the transitions we experienced that created a wee bit of challenge in the early days.
And also just identifying those opportunities, both from a business providing a service, such as a delivery service to the public, and also identifying those contracts, for example, the NHS distribution. Like, how did you go about identifying those?
My overarching way of addressing things are looking at every customer and seeing if they have a problem, and do they have a problem we can fix. Now, that's not original thought by me, but just looking if someone's got something that's a thorny issue, can we help? And, some of them have come from conversations long before, when we've met with people, talked to people, networked, and made people aware of what we can do and what our capacity is and what our values are, what our purpose as an organisation is. And the NHS one came partly because we, in some of our parts of the business, we look to employ people that have some barriers to employment that may not be employed within the private sector because their output is less for some people than 100%. And we believe that work's an important part of life if someone's able to work. And if someone's able and wants to work, we create some posts that are typically, you'd call them supported employment.
So you first started on this diversification journey in 2003. Today, are you able to give us any details on what proportion of your income now comes from self-generated enterprise versus perhaps contracts or grants and so on?
Yes. At New Start Highland last year, our income was 2.1 million. Our total income was 2.1 million. 40% of that was purely through trading, 33% was contract, and 27% was grant. Now, the year we're now in, we're budgeting 5% growth in our total figure, but the big change is in our trading figure. We're anticipating that 48% of our income will be from trading this year, 33% from contract, and only 19% from grant. And since we started, it's been a gradual growth in trading income and a gradual reduction in grant income. There's no magic bullet. It's been slow, incremental growth.
Really interesting. And I would love to know, having done this shift over a long period from that very traditional charity model to something that's much more diverse, in this time, have you seen any shifts in terms of the sort of public perception of you as an organisation? Have you seen people's views on your organisation as a charity evolving at all, either for better or worse? Or has it not really been affected?
It's been cyclical. I think when we initially started doing trading commercially, we confused the public because we were advertising commercial services. And I think it's quite confusing for the charity when a poverty addressing charity starts delivering high quality professional services. And I would own that. I don't think we did enough work to communicate we are a charity, we are about transforming lives, we are about supporting people to realise their potential, and we can deliver this and this commercial service as part of our financial engine to enable us to do our social purpose. So we didn't communicate as well. We were focused on growing business, and we hadn't thought of the potential confusion we could have caused and did cause, but we've addressed that.
Absolutely. And I think for me, that narrative is so interesting because it's always very live. in this sector. And all the time you hear, on the one hand, people saying, well, charities should be more like businesses. They have things to learn from business. And on the other hand, you're saying, no, charities shouldn't be like business at all. They should have no overheads and no one should ever get paid. So thinking about, as an organisation, kind of how you walk that line yourself and tell your own story, I would imagine would be a very big consideration. So it's a really interesting reflection to hear.
Yes, and I think every organisation, the greatest asset is people. And we're going through a cost of living crisis and people need money to live. Now, I'm sure that many of the team of 70 people that work here would, if they could, work for nothing. But they still have mortgages to pay. They still need to eat. They still, in the north of Scotland, need to heat their houses even more than possibly other parts of the UK. And the cost of living increases for all of us. And if we want to deliver really good quality services for some of the most vulnerable people in our society, we need good quality staff, and we need to invest in our staff. And people need to earn enough to live, not just to cling on by their fingertips and survive. So we endeavour to pay our people fairly and well, because our people are who deliver the services, and without them and their incredible expertise, I would have lots of ideas, but it's people who deliver these services, and it's so important that we pay people fairly.
And that presumably has become more challenging for you as an organisation in this cost of living crisis. As we know, just looking at your local high street, it has had an impact on businesses, small businesses, in much the same way as it has of charities going under because their funding has been cut due to a shortage of cash in the system. And I would be really interested to hear to what extent that has been a challenge for you as you've grown the enterprise activities that you have, and also any other notable challenges that you've encountered along the way of going down this route.
I guess the whole thing of cost and energy costs going up and everything going up is a challenge. But the way I think is that's a reality. We can't change it. And if we put too much of our effort worrying about it, instead of focusing our effort and our energy in creating solutions, it's quite easy to get stuck in the headlights and get paralyzed, because it's not fair. It's not fair. We're still the fifth or sixth richest nation in the world, yet the amount of money, public money, that's available to deliver services for people in poverty is going down. And it's not fair on the people who need to use the services. The demand for our services are going up. Every service we deliver, demand is going up, yet the public purse for these services is getting smaller. And that's a pressure, it's a challenge. It's not just for me, it's for everyone that's delivering in this sector. And the only thing we've been able to do is focus on our enterprise activity, focus on what we can change, and not focus on the things that are out with our control and get upset by them. They're just reality. We can't change them. We can't change something. So let's put our energy and our effort in there. There's quite a few people coming talking about how can we work together? Are there ways we can deliver better services and streamline? So we have a few tenants in here and other people we're looking at coming on site, and other relationships where we can work together and can take some of their costs down and make it easier for them as smaller organisations to operate. So there's different ways we can operate. There's different ways that we can make society a little better. And part of that is not just being focused on us, but having a bit of a focus on how we can help, other smaller organisations. And I think there's something quite healthy for one's mindset when we think that way too.
So for somebody listening to this who works for a charity and doesn't have a particularly developed enterprise arm, what have been the main challenges for you as an organisation as you've gone down this income diversification route?
One that I will address initially that hasn't been a challenge, but I think it could have been a huge challenge, is our board. Now, our board are fabulous. They are great, But moving from charity to operating as a social enterprise, it was really important that we took the board on that journey, and they led in some of that. And for us, the way to do that was having the right people, having the right structures, having clarity of roles, and really good communication. We found that super important, that there was really good communication. And by communication, it's a two-way street, making sure that when we're talking about, when I, as a chief executive, was talking about a different model, that I was making sure I was listening as well as talking. Because when we're introducing a new model, it might be clear in our minds, but it's not always clear in someone else's. Other challenge, we found that some stakeholders didn't understand the social enterprise model. I think some don't still, and that's just a challenge. We need to support people to learn as much as they're willing to. Yeah, I think they probably would be the main challenges. There's a few tips I'd have for someone else that's going to go down the same route, if that's helpful.
Yeah, we would love to hear that. So let's say you've got a bevy of charity leaders who are listening to you now and finding this so compelling that they're thinking, wow, maybe this is something we can try. Let's throw our hat into the ring for social enterprise. What practical advice would you give them for getting started on that journey then?
Yeah. First thing I would say is listen to the right voices. Everything I've done in New Start Highland that's been of any note, someone has told me, oh, you can't do that, James. I think back to before New Start Highland existed, and I was working in a different organisation. I said, my then manager, oh, I see this gap, and we could develop these services. And he said, oh, no, there's legislation that makes that far too difficult. Forgive the very Highland voice. So listen to the right voices would be one tip. Have a clear plan. Think through what you want to do and create a plan. Because if you're going to be communicating about change to your organisation, to your board, to your stakeholders, to the public, if you don't have clarity of thought, there's not a lot of chance that those you're trying to lead are going to have clarity of thought. So have a clear plan. Another tip I'd have is find a mentor who's walked the path. Find someone who's got the scars, who's had the bumps and the bruises, because a good mentor can save us an awful lot of pain, an awful lot of heartache, and we'll make other mistakes ourselves. But having someone there just to bounce things off, because it can feel like pioneering sometimes, and that can be scary to do alone, and to make sure you're going the right way. So have a mentor. Another one I would say is be determined. Be absolutely determined. Once you've created your right plan and you've got your board on board and you know where you're going to go, there will be obstacles. There will be barriers. And for me, determination is simply when an obstacle is there, it's the question, no, oh gosh, that's an obstacle, stop this. It's, okay, that's an obstacle. How do we get over this one? How do we get round it? I think another one is we're thinking about making a switch from charity to social enterprise. Employ the right people. Employ people who have an enterprising mindset, who understand they have to generate every single penny of the cost to run their part of the business and profit to go into the charity. But when you're recruiting skilled people who understand business, who have an enterprising mindset, also be careful that you employ people who are aligned with your values. Because you hear people talk about mission drift, chasing funding. Well, if you create a whole commercial engine within your charity, it's very easy for that to lead the organisation. So make sure you're very clear about your values and your purpose, that the financial engine, the social enterprise part, is serving the charity, not leading it. And lastly, communicate. You can't communicate enough. You can't be too clear in your communication. Communicate internally, communicate externally, communicate with stakeholders, but communicate.
Well, James, it's been so great to hear about the journey of New Start Highland, and thank you so much for sharing all of those tips and insights into your experience. Thank you.
Pleasure, absolute pleasure. Hope it's some help.
We hope you enjoyed our discussion with James, and that's it for this week. We'll be back next week to find out how charities can platform their cause areas by getting involved with TV scripting. Plus, we'll be reflecting further on the general election outcome and its implications for the voluntary sector with the NCVO's Chief Executive, Sarah Elliott. But for now, thank you to our guest, James Dunbar. Our producer is Nav Pal.